So today we're going to do chapter 8, which is repairing after there has been a negative cycle or any type of rupture. So the difference between healthy couples and unhealthy couples is the ability to repair. All right, so how do you know if you need to make a repair with your partner? Well, the obvious answer is after a fight or some kind of combative argument, which i.e. negative cycle. Sometimes there is some kind of cycle going that is just more like tension in the air, but each partner is reacting to that tension. And in the reaction to the tension, if they're continuing to trigger each other, that is a negative cycle. It's just a more quiet one. And that's a good sign that something needs to be addressed. When there is some sort of attachment rupture, you feel unheard or unseen, or your partner feels invalidated, or someone is in a place where they're not sure their needs matter to their partner, or someone feels betrayed. And then when there is an attachment wound, and we'll talk more about wounds in chapter 9, wounds are bigger events that shake up trust to a much bigger degree than just kind of an everyday attachment rupture. All right, so why repair? Why not just keep moving forward and try not to let that happen again? Well, there's a lot of value in repairing. One, couples who aren't able to repair and they just sort of push things under the rug, the resentment just builds and builds. And what resentment needs to be relieved is it needs to be heard and understood. So if we're not taking the time to do that and to talk about some of the other feelings that may have happened in the rupture, then that resentment will just start to build, and it can really, take a toll on the relationship, especially over time. That's one of the reasons why you see couples doing really well at the beginning of the relationship and, having no problem whatsoever and not a lot of negative cycles. But then these little things happen along the way and they build, and they're not repairing. And then the next thing you know, all this resentment's built up, and that resentment contributes to less closeness. And then the next thing you know, we're so far apart, we don't know how we got here. Whatever it is that you're arguing about or having this negative cycle over, whether it be, sometimes partners are just talking about their closeness in their relationship, but sometimes it's over money or parenting or in-laws or any kind of, triggering issue, where we're going to dinner, the refrigerator door. I mean, it can seem like just the smallest things, but if you aren't able to repair the arguments that happen over those things, there's a good chance that whatever those surface problems aren't ever going to get attention and get the resolution that they're needing. Ruptures are an enormous opportunity to learn from, our relationship mistakes and our mistakes with ourselves and grow. You can't do that if you're not processing what happened that didn't go so well and learning from it. And then repairs are really huge opportunities for bonding. I mean, I don't want any couple that I'm working with to end up only bonding from repairs. There's lots of ways to bond, but when there is some sort of rupture, it's not a rupture if it doesn't kind of hit vulnerability underneath the surface. And if we're not, going back and kind of saying, hey, here's what happened, and sharing that vulnerability, we're missing this, again, this enormous opportunity to bond more fully, to see each other more fully, to get to know each other more fully, and to better understand how we can help each other feel safer and closer, not just with each other, but just in the world, in general, in life in general. All right, so let me see if we have any questions. Don't see anything. All right, so all of this is in the book. I'm going to, add a little more insight here and there, but the elements of the repair, right? Here's what needs to be sort of happening in this repair process. The first thing is that partners really, really, really need to be able to understand and see all of the attachment needs and unmet needs and emotions underlying just the anxiety and the anger. Most couples who don't have a lot of emotional health in their relationship, every single time they argue or fight or get in negative cycles, all they're seeing is each other's anxiety and anger. And Why? Not because they're doing it on purpose, because they don't really know how to get underneath into the attachment meanings and the emotions, the vulnerable emotions underneath there, or they don't feel safe doing it. And so, really, to do full repairs and to really help your relationship stop going back to the same negative cycles over and over again, we've got to understand ourselves and our partner through the lens of attachment theory, which is tied up with emotional safety. You know, there has to be some communicating with vulnerability. Otherwise, you're just going to fall right back into anger and anxiety, particularly anger, and or just even fear and shutting down. You know, communicating vulnerably, it's sharing the deeper feelings, the longings, the sadnesses, the fears underneath these behaviors that you're doing in these cycles that just aren't working and are creating the ruptures to begin with. Again, we really need to view each other through this attachment lens, which is my partner is trying to feel close and safe instead of my partner is trying to hurt me. I have never met a negative cycle in all my years and all the couples I've worked with where I could say, you know what, your partner is just really randomly trying to hurt you because they have nothing else better to do. There's always going to be something going on down there that's somehow this is the way that they're trying to feel safe and they're trying to feel close. And the way they're going about that might be really, really awful and actually causing damage. And there's no, excuse for that. Well, there's an explanation for it, but there's no excuse to keep going with that behavior. But we can't change the behavior if we don't know what they're really trying to do to begin with. So, I'm not going to have much success with trying to convince someone not to hurt their partner. They know that. They don't want to hurt their partner. But I'm going to have a lot of success teaching them better ways to feel safe and close. But first, I have to conceptualize the problem in that way. We have to, create emotional safety before we continue to address whatever it is that we're talking about. We need to, if you're having an argument about, let's say, sex, right? Someone's needs aren't being met and you get into this negative cycle, part of the repair process is saying, hey, we need to establish some emotional safety before we try to go back to this topic. Clearly, this topic, brings up a lot for both of us, and there's a lot of needs there, and sometimes those needs conflict with each other. So we need to figure out how to be extra safe with this topic before we go back to it. One really important thing is what I call in the work I do, sharing the function of the protection. Okay, so when we think of anger and we think of bad behavior in relationships that people do when they're triggered, we have to understand why they're engaging in those behaviors and why that anger is so important. What's the function of it, right? We don't need to say, I want to know the function so I can tell you why I should keep doing this. We need to understand the function of anger and poor behavior so we can figure out what it's actually needing to get resolved. What is it trying to communicate, and how can we go about getting its needs met in a better way? What kind of new behavior can we bring to the table? One way of sharing the function of the protection is, to something like, you see the anger, right? You see that, it's really clear, but underneath that, there's just a longing in me to know that you're willing to hear me. And when I don't know that, the anger just wants to motivate me to try anything just to be heard. Now, again, we're not saying I want to just stay stuck in anger indefinitely, but we're trying to get to the real core of the problem, which is a longing to know that I'm going to be heard. And when we can start expressing that outside of the angry outburst, the idea is that it's much more likely that partners are going to be able to lean into each other. What about narcissists? Do they also try to be close or just use the partner? Narcissists aren't capable of being close. There's a lot of situations where someone thinks their partner is a narcissist when actually what looks like narcissistic behavior is really narcissistic behavior is a function of the negative cycle, not necessarily because that person is an actual narcissist. I could never, ever say to anyone that's happening without seeing that person for a while. So, if you're certain though that your partner is a narcissist, this material isn't really going to help the situation. The narcissist needs to get help for their narcissism. And, even with a narcissist, no, they're not necessarily trying to be close, although in a roundabout way, at the end of the day, that sort of is what they're trying to do. They're trying to manage unmanageable levels of shame so they don't experience rejection. It just is really wonky and doesn't work. But this information, if someone is truly a narcissist, that there's no amount of emotional work in the relationship that you can do on your end alone that's going to cause their narcissism to go away. What do you do if your partner sees repair as a form of retribution? That's not repair. That's just in the negative cycle. So we need to understand what is it about this retribution that they're wanting to be heard. That retribution wants to be heard. That retribution wants to see change. I don't know what it is, but that's not a repair. A repair is I genuinely want to get back to closeness to you. Now, that retribution might be their attempt at trying to reestablish closeness, and there's something to be said for that, but it's not actually a repair. It's, again, negative cycle behavior. So I would want to say, hey, first of all, I don't know how you know that. Do they own that, or do you assume that from them? If they do own that and they are able to say, look, sometimes I want to go back into this repair because really I want to just keep, somehow kind of punishing you for messing up. The way to lean into that would be, hey, I don't want to be punished. That feels really bad for me, but I do want to hear more about what is that desire to punish me trying to say? What are you needing? What are you need? Are you needing to know that I can hear you? Are you needing to know that I'm willing to kind of shift my part over here? So yeah, I think it's just being able to distinguish negative cycle behavior from actual desire to repair. Okay, so another thing we want to do is, let me see, I think there might be a couple more questions here. One more and then we'll go on. What if my partner tends to see my attempt to repair as rehashing the past or rewinding the tape? Well, that's when you might want to say something like, look, wouldn't it be nice if, let me pause that for a second. What you're saying to me is they don't understand the value in the repair, right? They don't understand the value. For them, the repair means this is just going to be another opportunity for me to end up feeling attacked or like a failure or whatever it is for them. They don't have a good experience with repair. And the first thing I would want to do is I would want to lean in and understand more about that. I would want to be curious and go, okay, help me understand this. Like if it is just rehashing the past, like what's so bad about that for you? Are you not wanting to rehash the past because that takes you to a place of failure? Like help me understand. And then maybe validate that. Look, I get it. If you view a repair as just more reason to feel bad, of course you would want to avoid that. That makes a lot of sense to me. At the same time, wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to keep circling back to this same cycle that we keep getting stuck in over and over? Maybe there is some value of trying to kind of do these repairs in a healthier way, because I certainly don't want you end up feeling worse. That's not the goal here. So maybe what we can do is instead of just avoiding repairs, we can figure out a way to make repairs actually feel okay. And to do that, you really need to understand the blocks. So if your partner is having a block to even the most perfectly delivered information on your part, it could be that no matter what, no matter how perfectly you bring up a concern, they go into their place of I'm failing. And that block needs to be resolved. We need to figure out how can we help you engage in a conversation about behavior without it meaning that you have to just kind of shame spiral into this failure place. Or the block could be that when you try to talk about the repair and when you try to go through that, you actually go back into another negative cycle where, all those messages are just flying around between the two of you. So in that case, the answer is really learning how to stay out of a cycle when you're doing the repair. Okay, so more elements of a repair. So, this is where a lot of people do this really well, okay? explain themselves, and that wasn't my intention, and that's not what I was doing, and they can apologize, and they can say, I'm never going to do that again. Most people know how to do that, right? And there's nothing wrong with all of that. Those concepts do need to be expressed along with it. But what a lot of people are missing is the other stuff, the emotional work. And they get kind of stuck in just explaining themselves, apologizing, committing to change, and then just moving forward. And if this is all that's going on, there's a really good chance that they're just going to keep circling back to the same place again and again, because we haven't really healed and looked at some of that emotional stuff, that vulnerable stuff going on underneath the surface. And what I'm explaining in this whole, chapter in this whole presentation is addressing this deeper stuff, right? And not getting stuck. So when I say measuring, what I mean is don't not do it. It's okay to say to your partner at some point, that really wasn't my intention. After we've fully leaned into what it is they were, bothered by to begin with, and really trying to understand that, really trying to validate their experience. So we just want to make sure we're doing this in a way that's measured and in a way that is balanced with the emotional work of the repair. So we also want to avoid shame spirals. And that kind of ties into this question I just answered, which is, a lot of partners, they go so quickly to, I'm bad, I'm failed, like they can't take in any level of confrontation or concern without it turning into, I know I'm just so awful, I don't even know why you want to be with me. Well, nobody does that, is intentionally trying to take the mic from their partner in that kind of a situation. They're genuinely hurting and getting kind of caught up in their own bad feelings and shame. But if that's the response, they just abandoned their partner's stuff. They just abandoned their partner, left their partner alone with the concern, and took the mic and turned it into their own pain and bad feelings. And there's room for these thoughts and feelings, but it's not when your partner is bringing up the concern. This is something that needs to come later, and it's going to sound more like, when I mess up and let you down, like it is really hard for me because, growing up, mistakes weren't just mistakes. They were like reflections of your value. And you were kind of defined in any given moment by whether you were getting it right or getting it wrong. And so it is really hard for me to take in concerns, even though that's a normal part of relationships. But again, that's for later, because if your partner brings something up, that's the time to lean in. And instead of shame spiraling, a much healthier response is to kind of put that stuff aside and to be able to go, okay, look, I'm going into my own shame. I want to stay with my partner right now because that's how you be in a healthy relationship. And try something like, I see how I let you down and how my words impacted you. And I really do plan to keep working on that behavior. We want to use empathy as a driver for change as opposed to fear. I'm always, the reason that I do the work I do in the deeper levels of emotional processing and understanding yourselves as emotional beings and emotional hurts instead of just, the behavior, what we see on the surface, is because I want to help people empathize with themselves, and I want to help them empathize with each other. Or actually, I should say, I want to help them have compassion for their own experience and understanding of their own experience so that they can have empathy for their partner's experience and understanding their partner's experience. Because it is much more effective to be motivated by, I want to work on my part, or I'm sorry, I want to work on my part because I love you and I want to protect you out of love from feeling unseen and unresponded to. And I want to protect you and do what I can, to the degree that we can as a partner to protect you from hurting. That is so much more rewarding as a behavioral change motivator than, well, I just want to work on my part so you're not mad at me. That has limited effectiveness. And then, of course, I always say this, and I'll address it a little more in a minute, but we have to take turns speaking, being the speaking partner and the receiving partner. And when you're in that receiving role, and it has to be both at some point, but it has to be really clear, when you're in that receiving role or your partner's in that receiving role, your job is to stay with the partner and reflect and validate what they're saying. You don't have to agree. You don't have to take full responsibility for things that maybe, some of their perception, but you do have to try to understand them, reflect what they're saying, and validate their feelings. Okay. What happens when both partners have experienced a lot of unresolved conflict, and repair usually means brushing issues under the rug just to meet an immediate need? Both are afraid to bring things up because in the past, honest conversations have only led to more disconnection. At this point, there's so much left unaddressed, it's hard to even know where to begin the process of real repair. Well, that's a good question. That means, not only are you dealing with stuff ongoing day to day, but you have all this other stuff from the past kind of contaminating the present moment. And how on earth do you deal with all of it? Well, for one, some of these bigger wounds from the past that are heavily impacting the present via mistrust, we do have to go back and start to work on that, right? But we can't do that until we know how to stay out of negative cycles in the present. And some of this work is just having the discipline as a couple to recognize that there's no way that in one day or 2 days or a week, we're going to be able to resolve all of this. This is a process. We have to take this a step at a time. The very first step is just getting out of the negative cycles that you're in, the day-to-day ones, right? Because if you don't learn how to get out of those, then you're never going to be stabilized enough to go back and heal the past. So it's not about ignoring the past. It's about saying, hey, the past has really impacted us, but we're going to have to deal with that when we get stronger and more capable of dealing with that. And so you kind of have to figure out, how can we just learn to live in harmony, even though we've got all this big stuff going on? I'm not saying live with a lot of closeness, because that might not be possible if there's a lot of unrepaired energy in the air, but live in harmony, like two people who can be respectful to each other and hear each other out, and put kind of the past on the side for the sake of just being our best selves here in the here and now, so that we can, again, do some damage control. So we know build some level of safety up. You have to start somewhere to build safety up. And if the narrative is, well, we can't build safety because we're so unsafe, you can see what a stuck place that is. So sometimes you have to come together and decide, you know what? If we're going to do this, we're both going to have to decide that we're going to be willing to show up as our best selves in the short term and get stronger and start to build a little bit of trust and safety, so that we can start to deal with all the bigger stuff that's going on. And the next thing I would want to know is, like, okay, so you have, you try to have a repair conversation about some cycle in the present, and what happens in that repair that causes you to go off track and end up feeling more disconnected. I would not want to just understand it in the context of, well, we need to get better at doing these repairs. I would want to understand it in the context of what happened in this one singular repair that ended up taking you to a more disconnected place. Because whatever that is, it's the root of the problem. And once you can get to that root of the problem, it's going to be, it really will, what you'll find is that you don't actually need to keep going back and addressing, well, now we got to address this, now we got to address that. It will become more like, now we have to address this theme. And this theme is sort of rooted in this event that happened, or these chronic events that happened over the last 10 years or whatever. Does every single rupture need to be addressed and repaired? No, that's a great question. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. I don't believe every single rupture needs to be addressed and repaired. I do believe that there are situations where it's more appropriate to let it go, and I'll talk more about that. At what point does rehashing the past show that we haven't solved anything? Continuing to rehash the past and it's not getting healed means that somehow you're getting stuck in negative cycles every time you try to heal whatever happened in the past. And so we haven't had that healthy conversation around it yet. Or you're just, no matter how much healthy conversation you have around it, the wound is too big and one partner just cannot reattach. And that's probably not the case. Probably what's going on there is that every time you try to talk about it, you go into a negative cycle. And of course, it is not ever going to get resolved if you're going into a negative cycle. A lot of times in this situation, there's resentment that isn't being addressed. And sometimes it can truly be as simple as we're going to start with our resentment and we're each going to share, I have a lot of resentment about this thing that happened in the past, and I need for you to hear and understand that resentment. I resent that X, Y, and Z. You don't have to agree with why they resent it, but the receiving partner needs to lean in and go, you know what? I get that. I get why it makes sense to me that you're carrying resentment. I can hold that resentment. And then the other partner might need to share their resentment also. And all of a sudden, when we can get through that resentment layer, which is not being in a negative cycle, right? A negative cycle around resentment is, well, I have a lot of resentment for you. And the other person going, well, that's not fair. You shouldn't have resentment for me because X, Y, Z. That's a negative cycle. So a lot of times when we can just get through that resentment layer, then the couple is able to continue speaking to each other outside of a cycle. All of a sudden, like this energy just sort of releases. Shouldn't we be able to let things go after we've clarified mistakes or misunderstanding and held space for emotional connection? You should let things go when they're no longer causing trouble. You shouldn't let them go when they are still causing trouble. If you let things go that are causing trouble, they will continue to cause trouble over and over and over. It's easy to say, I think what you're saying to me is, shouldn't my partner let things go? And if your partner is truly not able to let something go, we need to figure out why that is, right? Most likely, they're not letting it go because you guys are trying to communicate it outside of a negative cycle. There is something that your partner is needing to say or be heard and understood about that isn't happening, that is causing them to not be able to let it go. So you can, we can spend all the time in the world telling our partner to let something go. And if they would just let it go, then everything would be okay. Probably not going to be effective. What we need to figure out is, what are they needing so it will go on its own. Okay. What if one partner can never seem to reinterpret their stories and forgive? Well, that's a problem. And we need to figure out what is getting in the way of their interpretation of stories. Maybe some of that is self-work. Maybe some of that is relationship work. Maybe they need some validation around their interpretation instead of being chronically told, you're reinterpreting, you're wrong, you're seeing it wrong. Maybe they are, but most likely what I have found when that is the narrative is one partner's never really being validated for their interpretation or having their interpretation understood. Absolutely, it might need to be confronted and challenged, but nobody is really open to confrontation and challenge until they've been heard and held, right? So if that hasn't happened, that's the first step. And usually when people start to feel heard and understood, they do start to open up to being able to forgive. However, if a partner is truly just so stuck in their narrative and so stuck in not forgiveness, I would absolutely need to look at that and go, okay, I'm not seeing that this is a relationship issue. I see this partner over here really holding them, really trying to understand them, really validating, really leaning in, and still they've got this block. So maybe I need to explore, is there some self stuff there that needs to be taken care of to help this partner, start to see and interpret these situations in a newer, safer way? Are they, in their interpretations that aren't working so well, are they kind of trying to avoid some shame, or what is going on here that they're having a really hard time reframing the relationship through the lens of attachment safety, which is typically what the block is. I'm going to go ahead and finish the presentation, and then I'll go back into these questions. Okay, so let's go forward. All right, so this is to kind of circle back to should we let it go? Look, we shouldn't let something go if it keeps coming back up over and over. If it's just constantly unresolved, that is a really good sign. Something can't be let go. However, in just a given moment when, you get triggered by your partner, that doesn't mean, just because you're triggered does not mean that you necessarily need to dive into a repair with your partner. Sometimes the repair needs to happen within you. It's still a repair. You're still showing up for your own painful feelings and acknowledging them and working with them. You're not necessarily just letting those painful feelings go and saying, well, I should just get over it, right? you're actually trying to understand yourself better. And in that, being able to say, this is really my work. This isn't, something that I need to address with my partner. And it's always a good idea just to talk to them about this work that you do within yourself, because that's bonding. But how do you know? Well, first of all, it's not always easy. It takes practice. It takes a lot of discernment, and it takes a ton of self-awareness to be able to kind of step back and go, okay, I'm triggered. What's really going on with me here? And there are times when triggers are more about your own unresolved feelings and past wounds before you even met your partner, and less about your partner, just getting it wrong for you, and vice versa. This is true for both partners. How does this work? Well, if we're carrying around a lot of unresolved pain and wounds from our past, it can really start to skew the meanings that we're making of our partner's behaviors, right? It can start to make meanings out of their behaviors in ways that, just might not be so accurate. So here's an example. They forgot to pick milk up on their way home. They said they would. Is that ideal? Certainly not. We all want our partners to be responsive to us, but also mistakes happen. But in your life, you have this history all throughout your life of being ignored and just unresponded to. And it's easier for you to go to this just like really quickly before you even have time to think about it, just very subconsciously go to, they're just trying to hurt me. They don't even care about me. Look, this is the confirmation of my biggest fears, that they're just trying to hurt me, without really being able to consider the bigger context. Okay, 9 times out of 10, my partner is going to remember that milk. But this, they're not maybe defined by that one time. That's a good time to not go to your partner and say, we need to do a repair around this milk, right? That's a time to give grace. Maybe not for you. Maybe your partner never remembers the milk, right? That's a whole other issue. That's why it takes discernment, because every situation is unique to a lot of different factors. Now, if you have a history of being let down by the people that you are supposed to be able to trust in life, you probably will be more sensitive to anything that comes along that feels like it might be an abandonment or a betrayal, right? Because you did experience throughout childhood, or even in other adult relationships, actual betrayals and emotional abandonments. Of course, your nervous system is going to be sensitive to that. That's how your nervous system is trying to stay safe. It learned to do that in an environment where those risks were very real. That doesn't mean that you are in a relationship now where those risks are that real. Okay. And so you can sometimes overreact to your partner's mistakes based on these past experiences of pain. And in this case, if you can recognize, yeah, that might be going on with me, that might be true for me, you might need to really take more time to process your feelings and get to know yourself a little better before you just bring it up to your partner. A lot of times we can just react so fast. And if you're saying, look, I kind of see some of that. Like, I did grow up in an environment where I had to learn to be really aware of any kind of letdown. And, next time I get triggered, I'm going to take a little more time with that before I just react. Either way, though, even if you do determine that there's self-work to do with that, you can still talk to them about it. It just doesn't mean that you need necessarily, for them to apologize or validate how you were impacted, and, the full repair thing. And, you might end up, when you are able to kind of step back and do some self-work before you go into the repair, you might just end up viewing their mistake in a gentler context that helps you bring it up in a gentler way. You might just determine, yeah, no, this is a problem. This is a pattern of unresponsiveness. It's not just about the milk. This kind of happens a lot. And that might need to be addressed with a more direct repair. Or you might, again, decide, we don't really need to repair this. I just kind of want to talk about what came up for me in the context of my past, and just as, a way to know each other, really. When is it relationship work? Well, if you've done your self-work and you really still feel like, no, this is something that needs to be addressed, right? Some of this is in me. Yeah. But also some of this is there is their behavior, and I need to talk to them about that. And a lot of times it's not either or. It's some of both. Self-work is still extraordinarily important because it stabilizes that piece of it. If you're reacting to your partner's wrong and your own self stuff, you're going to overreact, right? If you've done your self-work and you're only reacting to your partner, it's going to be more measured. It's relationship work if you can say, hey, if I don't address this, I'm going to end up carrying some resentment around this, because that resentment will start to show up in behavior. Let's say you can see the bigger context. You're able to say, look, my partner is great. They have all these strengths in the relationship. At the same time, I keep finding myself going back to not really feeling like these situations where I don't know they're thinking about my needs, or I feel kind of dropped. That's a time when, you still kind of feel uneasy about it. That's a time when it might be a good idea to engage in some sort of repair. If you notice that you're starting to have kind of negative feelings and behaviors toward your partner, that is a sign that there's something that needs to be addressed. You start noticing that you're not feeling as close as you'd like. A lot of times that's what happens with those with avoidant attachment, is they don't address things and they don't necessarily notice a lot of resentment, but they do notice, they can say, yeah, I'm not feeling as close. And they sort of start to just distance without it looking like a lot of anger. But that distance for an avoidant partner is often indicating that there's some sort of repair that needs to be happening. Okay. And then, so what do we do here? Well, this number one is knowing yourself, knowing your partner, knowing the layers of your triggers. To do a real repair work, you've got to really know what's going on with yourself and what's going on with them. And they've got to know what's going on with them and what's going on with you. That is the way to really truly understand and get to the root of the issue, so we can actually find some resolution and healing here, whatever that is, whatever that looks like, instead of, again, just continuing to go back into the same thing over and over and over, right? So someone said, well, what if my partner won't let something go? The first thing I want to know as a therapist, if I'm working with that partner, is what's going on. I want to know all the layers of this trigger, what's not getting addressed that you keep circling back to the same place of whatever it is that you're having a hard time letting go of. And so to do that, we have to understand, what I talk about a lot is the anatomy of a trigger. Okay. So it's what happens. This is your attachment system. This is the system in your body that creates relationship behavior. Okay. We can say it's a trigger of positive, or even I could do this with a positive trigger, right? But we're here to talk about repairs. So let's say, you're telling your partner a story about your day and you perceive they're just not really listening. They just look like they're not paying attention to you at all. And then your body starts to have some kind of response that you pick this up, and then maybe you have some kind of insecurities lingering around in you that start to get tapped, like, see here, look at me, I'm not even worth listening to, or beliefs that no one could possibly really care to know who I am, right? So then that starts to kind of get on board. And then we have I should have reversed those, the unmet attachment needs, which is, okay, in this moment, I don't really know if my partner values me. I don't know if they can really see me. I don't even know if they really want to see me. And that's a bad place. And when all that wells up, that's a lonely place. I feel rejected. I feel kind of betrayed by them. I kind of feel some fear. I feel some shame. And then that goes into these protective feelings, which is our body's mobilizing system. Protective feelings say, do something, take some sort of action. It could be frustration, or a skeptical feeling, or indignant, or real or even catastrophized fear. The fear is, this is never going to end. Here we are again, and I'm just always going to feel rejected. And then those protective feelings kind of amp up into behavior, which is, now my body's all fired up and I'm mobilized and I'm going to protest. I'm going to tell them they never listen, and I'm going to use always and never language. Okay. And then what's going to happen is then the partner is going to react to that, and then they're going to get stuck in a negative cycle. And so when they come back to repair, each partner really needs to have a really good idea of what just happened for them, because this is the stuff that needs to really be addressed to really fully get to see each other and know each other. And so we can start to shift all of this. Okay. All right. And so then what you can do once you kind of have this all mapped out is you can kind of write it as a narrative. You can go through each step, right? And when I perceived you weren't listening to me, my body tensed up, and then my self insecurities got touched, and then I felt rejected by you. And I love you so much, and it hurts to think that even in a moment you might really not want to see me and connect with me. And then when all that wells up, I start to feel scared that I'll keep feeling this way. And sure, a part of me knows that's catastrophized, but I have experiences in life where that did kind of happen. And then I get angry, and all you see is the anger and protest, and that doesn't land well on you, obviously, but underneath it is so much more going on. And if both partners can learn to communicate like that, it's just going to create much more bonding, much more awareness of each other, much more empathy. And partners are going to start finding new ways to manage these situations when needs aren't going met. What I have found over and over again is that when these kinds of conversations start to happen, instead of just staying up here in this, which is what negative cycles do, staying in these two zones, when these conversations start to happen, the relationship symptoms really do start to resolve on their own. It just starts to shift our entire felt sense of each other and ourselves and of the relationship. It softens everything. And then, we have to remember timing is so important. We can't go back and forth with this. Like one partner starts to say, when I perceived you weren't listening, and the other one goes, well, I was listening. I was just, and then they say, no, you weren't listening, so that doesn't work. That's basically, one partner's trying to share and get their attachment needs met. Then the other one feels like, oh, I'm being accused of not listening when I was. There's time for you to talk about that, but not when they're over here talking about a perception. Later, we'll deal with trying to maybe understand more about why the appearance of listening wasn't there, what was really going on with that. But this needs to happen first. The listening partner just needs to lean into that and go, okay, I get it. Like, even if they don't agree with the fact that they weren't listening, we all have experienced moments in life where we thought someone wasn't listening, and we can say, look, I know, I felt like that before, that someone wasn't listening, and whether I was right or not, it's hurtful. You feel invisible, you feel bad. And then they switch later, where the other partner gets to share their part of the cycle and their part of the trigger. And again, when they can do that, the symptoms do start to really decrease. They start having fewer cycles. The higher quality of your repairs, the fewer cycles you will have. And then, do I have 2 times? No. Again, we're taking turns sharing our experiences like this, owning the behavior, owning their part in the cycle, and apologizing. Okay, so we want to expand on apologies in repairs, right? So we don't want to leave it at, I'm sorry for hurting you. We want to combine that apology with empathic remorse, and especially in situations where it's very clear, look, I didn't like the way you talked to me, but the way I reacted wasn't so great either. And here's, regardless of what you did, I want to take responsibility for my part. And the other partner is also able to say, regardless of what you did to trigger me, I still want to take responsibility for how I manage my own trigger. And that's, I can see how you felt unheard. You grew up feeling unheard, and it's a really painful experience for you. You do need to know, to feel safe and close, that I'm going to do my best to protect you from feeling that unheard feeling in this relationship. And I get it. I have needs of extra care in some areas too. And I apologize for not being present, or if you felt you were being present, I'm sorry if you felt like sometimes when we're not present, it's hard to explain why I added this sentence. And if anybody needs clarification, I will give it to you, or for not being clear about my inability to be present. sometimes we just need to say to our partner, this isn't a good time. I can't hear you right now. I'm just too, my mind's too, worked up from work. Let's pause this and talk later, instead of just saying, I'll hear you, and then not really being present. And, it's something I'm going to work on. Okay, so your homework is the next time you and your partner need to repair, or if you just want to go back and find another thing that happened that you want to understand better about a cycle, you're going to fill out the anatomy of a trigger, and you can find this on the website, and use the example I wrote as a template to write your own narrative, and then share that narrative with each other and see what happens. So it's going to be, again, this, and then using this, assembling it into a narrative. And I know this is complicated, but the reality is this is what I'm doing every single session. I treat a couple over and over again. This is it. I'm diving into a moment. I'm trying to understand about that trigger. I'm assembling all the elements. I'm getting them to communicate about all this stuff in a new way. I'm helping them see each other. I'm helping them understand each other. I'm helping use all of this material to shift this. As a couples therapist, I am in the business of behavior change. It's just that I go about behavior change in a different way. I work on this stuff to shift this, instead of just saying, oh, if you just shift this, all this stuff will get better. There's some truth to that too, right? Of course, we do want to work on our behavior. But what I have found is getting down to the root of this stuff and figuring out how to help partners heal each other and heal themselves, and not have to go to all these bad places. So I'm, if people can, if you have access to therapy and you have a therapist who can help you with all this and help you understand all the stuff going on in these negative cycles, that's great. But if you don't have that help, I encourage you to, over and over and over again, every time you get a trigger and you get stuck in it and you end up behaving in a way that you don't like, try to do this. It helps it helps you understand yourself, and it helps your partner understand you when you can communicate it, and vice versa. All right, so we will go ahead and stop there. And it looks like I do have a lot of questions. So let me dive into that. What to do when you say it's something I'm going to work on and they expect you to be perfect at it? Well, that's a conversation. I mean, first of all, I would try to stick with try to encourage them to stick with it's something I'm going to work on. And before, really listen and really give you some attention for that before they go into, well, you have to be perfect. But if you're walking around the relationship feeling like you're being held to this unrealistically high standard that you can never meet, that's a conversation, which is later or outside of this, whatever this moment is about, whatever the cycle is about. You come to them and you say, look, I'm really doing a lot of self-reflection, and I want to meet you where you are. And, I'm really starting to see that, as a partner, the partner I want to be is a partner that helps protect you from feeling stress or feeling anxiety. And I'm recognizing that this behavior of mine can kind of trigger that. And I can't do all that work for you, but I want to do what I can. At the same time, I know that there's no way that I can get it right all the time for you. And what would help me feel safe and even more motivated to change if I knew there was going to be some grace for me, even though I'm not always getting it right. And then I'm not going to be just defined by those moments when I get it wrong, because when I get defined by the moments I get it wrong, that just kind of demoralizes me. So can we work together on this? Can you discuss the added blind spot that an individual might encounter when they grew up in an environment that was gender specific roles? There was also a religious moral dynamic. Well, I would want to know, the first question I have is, how are those blind spots, or maybe blind spots, showing up in the relationship? Blind spots aren't a problem until they start showing up in something. Are they saying, I'll never do dishes because the men in my house didn't do dishes, or I'll never do XYZ because that's not what women do? I would want to unpack that in the moment and figure out, like, okay, so here's a really good reason. Like, as a male and you do dishes, what is that going to feel like for you? Why is that hard for you? Is that, part of your identity? Is it that, you would feel weak? Is it that, I don't know what it is. I mean, it's clearly something about doing dishes after growing up in a home where men don't do dishes would feel really bad. I would want to understand more about what feels bad. Would it bring up shame? Would it bring up feelings of failure? Would it bring up feelings of unfairness because I'm over here doing all this other work that men do? Does that necessarily resolve the problem? Not necessarily, but it's a start. I just would want to understand more. Instead of saying to someone, you just refuse to do dishes because of your gender specific role issues that you grew up in. Most people are not going to respond well to that. I would lean in and just be like, give me a little more information around this. Like, what does that mean to you? Like, how was it in your house? And that doesn't mean you have to be okay with the fact that they do dishes. I mean, at some point you need to come in and go, okay, I want to lean into that. I want to understand more. Thank you for sharing that with me. Here's my perspective on it. I feel a little resentful if, I'm the one having to keep up with all this stuff. And, we have a life together and it would be nice if we didn't have to, I want to honor your gender roles. That feels important to me. I know that was important to you growing up and it worked in a lot of ways, but I'm also kind of needing some help coming over to my side too, because here's how I see some things. So it's not like you're, accepting the behavior or agreeing with the behavior, but at least you're trying to understand them a little bit more. And when you can start leaning into that, instead of just judging them for the gender specific roles, you're really trying to understand why this is so valuable to them. What does it mean to them? And not kind of just calling it bad and dismissing it. People generally start opening up more and getting a little more flexible and start trying, maybe being a little more open to different ideas when they start to feel heard and seen. And I would do the same thing with the religious moral dynamic. Again, if it's staying stuck and you're super unhappy with how all of this is showing up in behavior, that's another conversation. I would want to know more, but the start is just getting out of judgment and trying to understand. Judge the behavior. I don't like it that you don't do dishes, but as a human, I'm willing to recognize and try to get to know more about, all this stuff that you grew up with that matters. I want to know more about it. What if they stonewall, closing down and wanting space with no defined timeline on when they're ready to engage? How do you repair with a partner who chooses disconnection over connection? Well, somehow stonewalling is a way to stay safe. For some people, it's staying safe from feeling overwhelmed, from getting in a fight, from feeling even more disconnection. It's their way to express anger when they don't know how else to express it, which is going to help them feel safe instead of just not expressing the anger. So somehow there's some function to the shutdown. I would need to know, what are they trying to accomplish here when they're stonewalling? What are they going for? There is some attachment need underneath that. Does it work? No, it does not work. They do need to be able to come back to a repair for the relationship to be healthy. But before we're going to get them there, we need to understand why they keep going back to Stonewall, why Stonewall is safe. I would try to maybe understand that more outside of the situation. Go, hey, look, I'm really trying to get this repair thing going for us. I think it's going to be a lot better, when we can kind of get to a place where we don't have the same fight over and over. But I notice when we go into the repair, something in you says, back away, back away. I wouldn't even say the word stonewall. I would say something feels safe about backing away. Help me understand that. What's so safe about that for you? And absolutely, you need to say, here's how it doesn't work for me, right? If you're backing away and that's just your go-to because you don't want to make things worse, but things keep getting worse, that really doesn't work for both of us. But I want to understand more about why you're needing to back away so we can maybe work through that and find something different we can do. And maybe I need to look at some of my stuff too and do something different. Maybe there's something I'm doing that's encouraging that back away. I'm open to that idea too. Either way, the stonewalling / backing away, it's just not working for us. But again, you're leaning into understanding it and leading out of judging it. The way that I communicate with the couples and the partners that I work with is how ultimately I need them communicating with each other. if a couple comes to me and I say stonewalling is bad, you're stonewalling, you have to stop stonewalling, you can't stonewall anymore, you're choosing to disconnect, that's going to have such limited effectiveness. They're going to keep stonewalling or they're never going to come back to me. The way I'm going to get that to shift is diving into it and understanding it and getting them to see what they're doing to stay safe and how I can give them a much better option for staying safe. And so if you're doing this work, that's the work that you guys have to do with each other, is figuring out what we're really needing here. What is that stonewalling saying? It can be hard to do it on your own. Sometimes you need a therapist. You know, the book is meant to help people do that together. But with practice, I think any couple can get really good at just leaning into each other instead of arguing, judging, you know, all of this stuff. Can you discuss, clarify conscious and unconscious actions that sometimes become a block to understanding? Yeah, I mean, most of the behaviors are not consciously implemented. Nobody is going, you know what? I feel hurt. And because I feel hurt, my body feels mad. My body wants to just get desperate and do whatever I have to do to be heard. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start telling my partner how awful they are. And if I can get them to see how awful they are, then this light bulb will go off in their head and they will say, oh my gosh, she's right. I'm going to change now. That's conscious, right? Unconscious it goes from the trigger to the attack in 1/34th of a second. And it happens so fast that nobody has time to think. That's why you got to go back to that anatomy of a trigger and make the unconscious conscious. Okay. I'm going to show you this thing again, just to, whoops, that's not it. I think I closed it out. That whole anatomy of a trigger is making the unconscious conscious. So you can work with it. If you just keep all that stuff unconscious and not over and over and over again, understand it, see it, then it will continue to haunt you. Okay. Because you won't know what's going on. You will just know, oh my God, I felt so big and strong and something happened to me. And then I did that horrible thing again. When I'm working with, a couple for, I'm doing these intensives now for, I don't know, anywhere from 14 to 20 hours of intensive work. I'm doing that over and over and over and over again. I don't know how many dozens of times each partner is understanding themselves through that. I don't show them that scaffolding. I'm usually always writing it on my own, but I'm just helping them walk through it over and over and over again. So by the time they're done with me, they have a really good conscious understanding of why they're doing what they're doing that's not working. And it's so much easier for them to shift. And I've also given them tons of experiences of doing something new in the sessions. If you don't have access to that, the work is right here. Also, the course is out that I keep talking about, the anxious attachment course. I do want to make an avoidant one at some point. Several hours long. It takes you through that scaffolding over and over and over and over again, going deeper and deeper and deeper with each repetition. And that is a great way to really dive in and start doing this work experientially. What I'm doing right now is I'm giving you the information. Information is one thing, doing it experientially is the other. That's why I created the course. But if you don't want to do that course, then just use that anatomy of a trigger with the narrative and go through it yourself. That's the experience of it. How to do self-work around resentment that I know I shouldn't feel. Okay, first of all, you should feel resentment. Absolutely, you should feel resentment. It's just, what is the resentment about? Does it really belong to your partner? If it doesn't really belong to your partner, where does it belong? The resentment is real. It needs to be listened to. It needs to be heard. Again, this is where I would encourage you to do the course. I do a whole piece on anger. It needs to be heard. It needs to be listened to. You need to figure out what it's all about, what it's needing to heal. I don't want you living with that resentment. I want that resentment to fade away, okay? But I also know that it doesn't just go away out of will, right? It goes away when we start to understand it. Even people that feel less resentful over the course of years, they're still doing the inner work over that course of years. They might not have words for it, but they're still processing through it, right? Wouldn't it be nice if you didn't have to let that resentment dissolve over 20 years of, over the course of 20 years, but you were able to really dive in, listen to it, honor it, own it, validate it, and listen to what it's needing to be released. Maybe you need to recognize, it's not appropriate to resent my partner for this, or I don't want to say not appropriate. Probably some of that resentment does belong to them, honestly, if it's there. But let's say it's not. Let's say they have not done anything in this area where you have this resentment. We need to figure out, is this old unmet needs that you experienced growing up that you just carry some resentment for and you've never had space for that resentment? It's time to be able to say to yourself, I do resent that, every time I tried to get my mom to understand me, she just told me how bad I was or ignored me or whatever. I do have some resentment to that. It doesn't mean I need to hate my mom. It doesn't mean I need to see her as the worst mom ever, but that resentment is real. My body felt it every time it happened. And you don't need to tell it to your mom. Maybe you do, maybe not. Maybe your mom wouldn't be able to hold that. You just need to acknowledge it to yourself. Yeah, that resentment is real. And then we got to go in and feel all the other feelings underneath the resentment, the loneliness you felt, the rejection you felt, and sit with that and let the sadness around that come up and give that sadness what it needs. Does it need space? Does it need comfort? Do you need to talk to someone about it? It definitely needs space, right? And comfort and just being with it and some grieving, right? And when you can do that and also own the resentment, typically that resentment will start to fade. And then, great, when that resentment isn't there, it probably won't keep getting triggered in these moments when that story that you're describing comes to life, when your partner's, doing all these things that triggers this wound. If we heal the wound, the resentment doesn't need to be there anymore. It's just getting what it needs. What do you suggest when both partners want to repair but struggle, get stuck on what the compromise looks like? Well, first of all, if you're trying to address the compromise and the solution and the problem before you have done the emotional work, you're both going to double down on the compromise because you're trying to resolve the emotional stuff by trying to get your partner to go along with your way. You're trying to say, I need to know my needs matter. I need to know this. And I don't want to devalue the fact that whatever it is you're compromising on is important. It obviously is, or you wouldn't be fighting about it. But we need to understand more about why it's important to you. What's the emotional stuff? What's the fear around the compromise? Whatever it is, like I'm afraid that, if we spend too much money on the car, that's going to lead us to being stressed in all these ways. And, that's not going to feel good for us. And there's also this part of me that needs to know that you can see me for that fear and that you're not just going to devalue that fear and say I'm being ridiculous, that you can lean in to say, you know what, I get that. I get that fear, right? I have fears of my own and I want to be seen for those too. So it makes sense to me. Typically when that conversation can happen first before we try to write the, solution, people start to soften and flex up. Now, if it's such a deal breaker, right, that you've done the emotional work, you're hearing each other, you're understanding each other, you're leaning into each other, but still you're on so far away from each other that you can't possibly agree, that situation, it calls for, I would say, it's hard, but I would say give it time, come back to it later, see if you can both process and come back around. I mean, worst case scenario, if it's some serious lifestyle issue and like you can't meet each other no matter what. I mean, one person wants a family, the other person just absolutely doesn't. Maybe that's when we say, hey, this is, a deal breaker. We can't go forward with each other. Sometimes it's going to look like, I'm going to go along with you on this one, right? But in the bigger context of the relationship, we're able to do that for each other. It's not just one partner giving in all the time. What happens when one partner occupies most of the emotional space? They want to be heard, validated, and comforted, but struggle to recognize their own role in the dynamic or take responsibility. this leads the other person to feel like there's no room for them. That's very common with anxious attachment, where their anxious attachment starts to sort of take up all the space, right? So, couple things. One, the self-work is truly needs to be there. What is their block from taking in validation and being heard and comforted? Probably there's some shame and views of self stuff stuck there that they need to resolve on their own. They need to start showing up for their own self emotionally before they can expect to fully take it in. They could be having an expectation that you're not going to be there to do the relationship work of hearing and validating them, but you're also going to be doing the relationship work plus their own self work, in which case there's no amount of your hearing and validating that is going to be enough if they're not able to give themselves the same heard and validated. That means they need to believe they deserve it to begin with, right? And that's probably what's going on there. There's some beliefs there that I'm just too much, I don't really deserve it, and that needs to be addressed. And then, hopefully the idea is that when they can start showing up for self more fully, then they're able to take in what you're offering. Now, that's given that my assumption is that you are showing up and you are hearing and you are validating. And I know it's hard because what do you say to someone? You do need to do your own self-work. But what you might say is like, look, I want to take responsibility for my relationship part here. I know that it is vital to our safety and closeness and you're being fulfilled in the world that you are able to get this stuff from me. But I kind of have an idea that you're struggling to give it to you. And I think if you're having a hard time giving it to you, I don't know how much of that I can give that's going to fully help you. And are you willing to, try to kind of do some of that work for yourself? And then you might need to say, look, sometimes I do feel like, your big emotions, I want to be there to help them. But sometimes I do feel like it kind of leaves me kind of choked out and not able to kind of show up with my own stuff. And then I'm not getting heard and validated. And then I have a hard time feeling close. So wouldn't it be nice if we both could get these needs met? And maybe you need to do some self-work too, right? So it is a matter of understanding there is a huge relationship importance to meeting each other's attachment needs, but that can't happen outside of each partner also being able to do their own self-work. Okay, I'm going to finish these up. Okay, what happens when, I already read that one. My partner has these cycles of wanting to work on things, trying to do that by reading something, making promises about doing homework or exercises. But as soon as we get into a negative cycle, our motivation drops and he thinks he can never change. He says things like, I can accept that I will never learn this. And he wants to break up or go no contact for a while. This calms him down, but really hurts me, understandably. After a week or two, he comes back totally motivated again. And the cycle starts again. This way, we never get to really work on things. Do I have to accept that he will just never get to doing the work, or is there a way to get us out of this? Well, I mean, it doesn't sound like it sounds like he's coming and going. I wouldn't be okay with that. I mean, I don't ever want to encourage someone to break up, but if he is breaking up with you and coming back, that tells me you're not like married with a family. But I would want to maybe, you have a right to either you can accept that he's going to keep doing this and just love him in spite of it and deal with it and hope that over time it starts to shift. Or you can say, hey, this isn't working for me. It's too hard on my nervous system to never really know when you're going to go away again. Like I can't live in that environment. But I would want to know, as soon as we get into negative cycles, his motivation drops. I would want to know what happens right there when that motivation drops. Does he feel demoralized? Does he feel like a failure? Whatever happens emotionally, it turns into him of shame spiral, right? Now I'm never going to get it right. I'm never going. So I would just want to be curious about that. I would want to say, what happens in the cycles where, you're reading all this stuff and clearly something important happens that kind of blocks your ability to do these new things. Is it that you don't quite know what to do, or, something comes along that says, I'm not going to get it perfect, so I'm going to be a failure no matter what I do? I would want to just kind of explore that, get to know more about what happens. I would certainly encourage you to look at your part. Are you, is your cycle behavior in this cycle kind of contributing to him feeling kind of demotivated? I don't know. It could be, it might not be. Usually two people are kind of playing into the dynamic in their own different ways. But I would maybe want to name that behavior, which is his motivation drops and he thinks he can never change. I don't know what we would name it, but that moment when you just get demotivated, what happens there? Why does he get demotivated? Why isn't he staying in it at that point? Why is he needing to say things like, I can accept that I will never learn this, right? Like, why is that a safe place for him? What is it that he's wanting to do differently? I don't know that either. That, it sounds like I can never learn this. Is it he's reading all the books, but he's still in these moments doesn't have a clear idea of what needs to happen? I would have him look at that anatomy of a trigger and try to go through that, try to figure out right at the last negative cycle where he found himself being demotivated, what happened right before that, because that's the trigger. Right before that his body goes into a spiral, and then the way he handles that is, I can't do this. My wife and I have gone to therapy for a few years. We have talked about repairs. My wife is still not able to express her part or her mistakes or apologize. I'm guessing she doesn't feel safe to do so, and I'm not sure what I could do differently. Also related, we have learned that conflict isn't bad. Yet whenever conflict comes up, it appears to me that my wife feels unsafe and it seems to lead to more disconnection. So the first thing I would have to know is what is getting in the way of her ability to express her part. You said she doesn't feel safe. Yes, that's true. What doesn't feel safe? What's the danger there? We got to know what's so dangerous about owning your part. And I sometimes will say to people if they're having a hard time with that, like, let's just say you do have a part. Let's just say hypothetically, you do have a part. Like, what might that part be if you do have one? And if they can kind of name what that part might be, then you can kind of go into, well, what doesn't feel safe about that for you? Is it that she's afraid that if she owns anything, then it's just going to all be used against her and she's going to get blamed? You might try that to say, the way I see it is that we both truly are kind of contributing to this, and I'm willing to own, my stuff over here. And I know you're having a hard time. And is there some belief that maybe, if you own some of it, then that means that you're just going to be the one that gets blamed, or like what's going on? Because, I think it would be nice if we could both sort of own how we're contributing to this. Because if we stick with this narrative that it's just sort of all me, I'm not really sure that's going to get us anywhere. And that must be really disempowering for you to think that all your happiness is kind of dependent on whether or not I start to change. I mean, so I just don't know if that narrative is really going to get us anywhere. I've started the anxious attachment course. Oh, good. I'm dying to know feedback on this because I haven't had any feedback yet. It's already helping so much. Yay! I'm so glad. These parts that are anxious, angry, or sad have never been acknowledged this way before. And I'm doing it for myself now. I'm also getting what sit with your feeling actually means. And I'm learning how to do that with this course. Thanks. So worth the money. Okay. Promise I didn't coerce her into doing that. That makes me so, so happy. This is the first feedback I've got on it. Been just like waiting and waiting, asking Katrina every day, has anybody finished it? Have you had any feedback? So thank you so much, Angie, for that. I've read your book, listened to your podcast, and have started your anxious attachment course this week. Julie, you rock. Well, thank you. It's always good to hear. I'm so glad. Please let us know how the course goes for you. All right. I am worn out at this point. So let me go into, okay, that's Katrina. I think I've gotten to everything. All right. Well, I'll go ahead and put us on pause there for next week. I don't see anybody wanting to come on camera. So, all right, guys, thank you so much for coming. I hope this was helpful. And we'll pick up next week, chapter 9, which is healing attachment wounds, sometimes called attachment injuries. These are those bigger things that happen in the past that just keep coming alive over and over again in the present. So, all right. Well, thank you, everybody. Take care.